I'm Jack. My mission is to kill chaos.
Hello War of the Visions fans, I'm Jackie Fox, and recently Ready Player Will released a very interesting video, kinda guide to the elements of randomness in War of the Visions, while also making the point generally that there was a lot more randomness lately, and that these elements of randomness were also increasing. The predictability of the game, which is something that is particularly important for content creators like himself and me, who more often look at the data and try to come up with character evaluations based on some sort of empirical idea of how this character will do in general situations. I really liked this video and I do recommend it. It does a good job with it. I'll be using stills from that throughout this video as well. But I really think that this is such a good topic that it's one that really deserves to be broken down and also focused in on. So, after my car broke down today, I had a couple of hours pacing around a mechanic's office to write the absolute thesis on
chaos
theory within War of the Visions. Really, I would like to reframe this as an analysis of chaos itself. Because, you know, there are ways to predict and model chaotic systems. It's not impossible, but it is more difficult. It's definitely more difficult for an individual, like a content creator, to be able to do alone, and it makes it nearly impossible to do this based on purely anecdotal data. This is why I have, especially recently as it's become available, been interested in using more of the crowdsourced load of data on average, because at large enough numbers you can see the shape of randomness, and it ceases on a certain level to become random. It becomes more and more modelable and predictable. And if each individual fight is unpredictable, you will know that in a certain number of scenarios a certain thing is still most likely to happen. So for me,
chaos,
especially within this game, breaks down into two things that are actually pretty similar, but I think should be discussed separately. The first of these two things is complexity, essentially nuance and niche. This, as Ready Player Will points out, kind of negates power creep in some small ways, at least when it's combined with randomness. Because even a really weak character like Miche has the opportunity to hit you with something like Toad, and the game could go really differently for you because of that, and just this empirically weak character could potentially negate one of the strongest characters in the game, through Toad, a status that nobody really builds a resistance to because people rarely use it. I think a really good example of complexity within modern games is Magic the Gathering. And that being said, there are still meta decks, and there is still a certain amount of predictability to who will win, what matchups, and how consistently. However, there is potentially even more randomness and complexity within Magic the Gathering than any other game, but also War of the Visions itself. And this doesn't stop either from being a fun game. I would say the things that are stopping Magic the Gathering from being a fun game at the moment are related to a corporation that now owns this game. But the game in and of itself is one of the most complex games known to man, if not the most definitively. And this also makes it wickedly fun in certain scenarios. This also means that in opposition to the general trend of automatic play within PvP and War of the Visions, there's also this level of how you pilot your deck and how you play with it. And this fact also adds a level of complexity and randomness. There's also the fact that Magic is played in best-of-3 matches within competitive, and hopefully this brings a little bit more of how you build and how you play to the forefront as opposed to pure randomness and complexity. Another thing that adds to this is the fact that for those last 2 matches you're also sideboarding, and you may bring in cards that counter your opponent's deck or make you more consistent against them, or maybe even bring in things to counter things that you think that they may bring in from their sideboard. This makes the ultimate outcome of any individual game of Magic very complex to predict, even in a matchup that's relatively predictable. In fact, it's often played in a best-of-3, and this ultimately helps avoid enough of the randomness that can ultimately be predictable as a whole as well. But at the same time, 2 decks matching up against each other could have wildly different outcomes based on who's playing them, how they play against each other, what they know about each other or their other decks, what they have in their sideboard, how they use those cards in their sideboard as well. It's a lot, but I would argue that this actually makes the game more fun and not less. And I feel a lot of the same way about complexity in War of the Visions. Now, complexity, before I get into any specific examples, isn't something that is new to WotV Visions. It also isn't just a linear climb upwards as new systems are added. There are things and were periods of time in which developmental choices actually drove down the complexity of the game. Within the game's first year and a half or so, there were definitely incentives to build elemental teams. Well, at least there was one big one, and that was that there was elemental chaining. There was also no real way to deal with elemental chaining at that time, so this was just one extra advantage that you could use in battle to push your team over the edge. That being said, strategically, you could also potentially use any combination of elements on teams of that era because all of the vision cards were universal up to a certain point. And there weren't any effects that gave buddy bonuses through master abilities either to units of the same element. Therefore, there weren't a lot of factors that were really pushing the mono-elemental teams to be the most powerful in the game in a definitive sense. Or at least that's how it was within the first year or so of the game. With the introduction first of master abilities that gave elemental bonus to partnered characters, but also the introduction of extended bonuses for vision cards, meaning that vision cards that were originally purely universal now also had an additional bonus for a specific element, which gave you a certain incentive to build a team of cards that all benefited that element. But also around that same time, and I think even actually a little bit before it, they were introducing elemental vision cards. So with this system, you know, there were some vision cards that had 3 abilities on them, and they were really good and that remain really good, although they were held back a little bit compared to the power that were ultimately given to the max power of elemental vision cards. And these elemental vision cards would all natively have 3 abilities, but the catch compared to previous vision cards was that every one of those abilities would be activated only by a single element. And it was like this until they introduced job-based vision cards, and there are some like promotional vision cards that they've released that are, even to this day, purely universal, but that is definitely not the trend. So it was very easy to see that by playing into a system that was already strongly predictive, elemental matchups have always been a very strong indicator of success when you're going up against a mono-elemental opponent. I think that job-based VCs are taking back a better position that we haven't seen in a long time and making multi-elemental teams that have more complexity to them naturally, making those a very interesting thing within in the meta. And I think that over time, those sorts of teams will really become more dominant. So as this reduction of complexity has been lifted with the introduction of job-based VCs, alongside all of this, we've had more and more mechanical systems added to the game over time. First, we get a bunch of defensive systems, which add a layer of complexity because certain characters do better against certain types of attack and have different ways of defending. We've always had a lot of these, like unit attack, area resistance, attack type resistances, defense, spirit. All these things have been in the game for quite some time. But my point is that when it's enforced by strong elemental matchups, the complexity takes a backseat to the importance of elemental matchup itself. As a break from these, and as we break away from these elemental matchups within the meta, then we're going to be moving into a point where there's more and more complexity within the game, and this leads, therefore, to less predictability. Personally, I think that in a lot of ways this creates a more fun, engaging, and dynamic type of system than just playing rock, paper, scissors. I didn't come here to play Pokemon. I came here to play a complex fantasy game that was modeled on Final Fantasy Tactics. So I feel like this feeding into just an elemental game shouldn't be the only important thing within WotV Visions. With that out of the way, let's look at some of Ready Player World's slides. All these slides actually indicate things in different ways. So there's definitely an element of RNG in the reincarnation system, and we'll talk about that more in the next video. But the element of complexity it adds is basically just because of the UI. There's no way to tell how reincarnated a character is reliably. There's no indicator for this, and because there's no indicator for this, it's really difficult to gauge how difficult an enemy is going to be, and whether they push your team behind its thresholds, or whether or not they stay well below them. Can they surpass you or will they not? And how much do these increases and statuses really make at the end of the fight? Those are all questions of complexity. I described strategist Old Zoa as being a defensive onion, because she had so many layers of defenses and it was really hard to penetrate all of them at once, and that made her a relatively stubborn character against a wide variety of different types of teams. So even with this kind of onion, there's still complexity, and of course these things can be weakened and they can be dispelled as well. Some things may dispel some effects better than others. And when you add in the whole idea that all of this can change the damage calculation on a match-by-match basis and a character-by-character matchup basis, a multitude of ways at different levels of effectiveness all happening at the same time, some of which being penetrated, some of which being amplified. All sorts of crazy things are going on simultaneously, and it becomes incredibly difficult to predict when you're going to be at 70 HP or below, specifically within a fight. And a good example of this is Skahal. One of the characters get Threshold Courage. This is a form of automatic courage, and therefore has some strategic advantages over regular courage. You can't spell it, but you also can just by breaking that threshold before dealing the fatal damage. And Skahal himself is a character who can, in theory, last for ridiculous amounts of time in combat and take like 50,000 damage potentially without dying if you heal him enough. Or he can take 2 hits in a row the wrong way, and the healer just misses the whole tempo of the fight, and he goes down like an absolute punk without dealing a bit of damage. It is the fact that this happens 100% of the time when it lines up with a preset set of conditions. That is complexity on the battlefield. You don't go into fights necessarily knowing which of these conditions are going to be important or how much they're going to play out in an individual match. And you could also look at various types of dispels and the way in which, essentially the same way when you're talking about incredibly specific dispels. These work really great in certain matches, for instance, like Joom's LB is really good at dealing with especially light right now, because 2 of its main characters both go into wider area attack defenses, and you can dispel that with Joom. You can potentially do a lot more damage to them with her kit. There's also a bevy of characters for which this does absolutely nothing. Unless they happen to have a partner on their team like Helena, the Black Rose, who can buddy buff this. In that case, any character can have this status on them, and therefore this is useful again, potentially. So simultaneously, any character can have this applied to them, while at the same time a seemingly exceedingly low number of characters actually have this ability. And even less of them, far fewer, can actually buddy buff this. So the likelihood of this going on, say, last well is incredibly freaking low. But you could also run into a scenario where this becomes important in a fight against last well. Buff weakening is another example of this. I think it's really strong because there's a lot of things in the game that count as debuffs, and every couple of months we get a new way to debuff enemy characters. And debuff weakening provides you blanket resistance from those new powerful designed characters to a certain degree in a way that's kind of across the board. I mean, this isn't really random at all if you have 100%, but most characters don't get anywhere near that, even in most scenarios. So how much does it matter that the 60% shred was only actually a 30% shred in the last given fight? Would that damage have been enough to have pushed you below your 70% threshold before someone else dealt damage to you or not? You know? And then finally, going back to things that Ready Player Will was talking about in his video, there's chain resistance. This affects some teams more than others. For some teams, we'll be able to chain more, and we'll chain more in certain scenarios. It all really comes down to the individual speed/affinity of each individual character on the field. Now that affinity has been uniformly maxed, the complexity here actually comes with whether or not you're using that toggle to turn it off, which has strategic benefits and drawbacks itself. Even the very concept of affinity, while it was simplified, is still a matter of complexity on the field that is actually even more polar than it was before, because it was possible for units to have, say, like 3 of 5 affinity and be in the middle. Now that's no longer possible. They're either a 1 or a 0. I mean, they're either a 5 or a 0. It's a binary choice at this point. And like all of that, in addition to their buff order and how they come into combat, who has hate on the opposing team, how they bunch coming into the other team, all of that is going to depend on how easily they're able to chain with each other, which also is going to come down not only to their physical location on the map, but also their location in time through turn order. The smallest of changes in my experience, changing a TMR to one with less agility or more agility, can completely alter this in certain scenarios on a really fundamental level that is maximally hard to predict and always really has been. So the idea of a team's ability to maximally chain is already a little bit up in the air in some cases. Some teams are really, really good at doing it consistently because they all have chaining moves and you're intentionally putting them all in the same element or attack type or whatever. So this is just really complex to know because, like, if you never get chained on in a fight, it did nothing. But also, if you do get chained on in a fight, because that's pushing damage up and the other thing's pushing it down, and how much of it you have is pushing it down, but also there's 6 other types of defense that are somehow, and also 6 other types of penetration, etc. How much does the chain attack resistance actually do? That's what I want to know! And because of the combination of both randomness and complexity, as I've talked about throughout this video, who the hell knows is ultimately the answer, and while you could be unsettled by that, I think it's kind of fun. Anyways, that's how I learned to stop worrying and embrace the complexity. So remember that the free-to-play option for YouTube is to like, subscribe, and leave a nice comment. Tell me what you think of the video, what you think about the things that we discussed in it. Tell me some stories. I want to hear the craziest reflex story that you can possibly think of in, like, multiple characters reflexing each other, multiple characters reflexing the same skill at the same time, all the just craziest, what's the odds stories in the comments. So for me, chaos, especially within this game, breaks down into 2 things that are actually pretty similar, but I think should be discussed separately. The actual randomness side of this is actually one of the more common ways it's being used right now. And even if you crunch all of the complexity about a fight, throwing in randomness just itself makes it harder to predict. And it also means that there could be matches where you would normally win easily, because a particularly clutch thing happened, and also fights where you lose easily because it didn't happen at all, or because it didn't even get a chance to occur for some other reason. So for this part of the video, I want to focus on things that are truly random. I would also like to point out that a lot of characters that I feel lean more into the specific style of randomness to win matches that they might not be able to win otherwise are called curveballs, or sometimes even wild cards, because I think either of those descriptions is pretty illustrative of the idea of the way that units like Helena the Black Rose, Vivi, or Sodley Christia fit into the meta. With the exclusion of passive hate, which can affect the movements of my characters or yours from the other side of the map from the beginning of the match, it's usually easier to predict with a certain level of exactness exactly how units will move to buff each other before other units can come into range of them. Because if you start out in the same way with the same conditions every time, you should see things play out about the same way. Also, there aren't a lot of elements of randomness in buffing. Sometimes buffs are linked to status effects, and this can mean that on some occasions these status effects won't land if your faith is lower than a certain level, but practically speaking, this rarely factors into matches. It's on the point when the 2 teams begin to clash that everyone starts moving in their own way, as each of them begin to evaluate the situation based on dynamic terms. To evaluate the complexity of the situation is already difficult enough, but in this video I'm going to demonstrate how true randomness adds an extra level of difficulty in predicting outcomes, at least when we're talking about an individual match. There's a double-edged sword with randomness, by the way. And that is that in large enough volume, it is predictable. We've predicted the chances of things happening. In fact, with a lot of the elements of randomness we see in War of the Visions, we have that percentage built into the equation. Now, how that interacts with complexity is especially difficult when you take into example counters. Counters, for instance, have a specific chance of happening, so you know that percentage. But also, they only trigger sometimes against certain damage types or certain types of attacks, or at certain ranges. So there's elements beyond just that percentage that also affect whether or not it's going to happen in the real world practically. But if we remove all of those elements of complexity, we look at some of the least complex counters. A good example would be reflex. Reflex is like the king of pissing people off over RNG in this game. I mean, ever since, definitely before Cloud, Reflex has been here since the very beginning. 15% chance of dodging either magical or physical damage. That's basically everything in the game, although not exclusively everything in the game, oddly enough. That happens 15% of the time, all the time, because it happens at all ranges against basically everything that comes at it. Which means that 15% is relatively overpowered compared to a lot of the other things that I just alluded to. So if a character consistently takes 4 or 5 hits to actually take down, then you're having maybe a 60% chance of reflexing one of those hits, surviving a little bit longer, and doing a thing that in other timelines you never would have done, which can completely change the outcome of the game. But the thing that really pisses people off is that some subset of those times, you're going to reflex the first 3 hits and just waltz through this like a fucking ballerina. And it is maximally frustrating when this happens. Even though percentages being what they are, it often is counterbalanced by the fact that many times that team won't get a single dodge in through reflex for entire fights. And for characters like Cloud, who are getting increasingly squishy, and I mean original Cloud with reflex, things like that, I think, make randomness interesting, and sometimes its interaction with complexity can really be a good thing as well. Because again, it would be really annoying if you almost always got charmed by subtly. I mean, this is kind of how it feels going up against characters that get these effects on AoEs, like Curse for Sephiroth, or Black Rose Helena and her sleep ability. Moving back to what Will said, there's a lot of randomness within the reincarnation system as well. You get your bonus stats, and this is a big part of your stats to be done randomly. This is why I always evaluate characters based on their maximum stats, and this is why it's sometimes hard to model what your team is going to do with my team, because my stats could be very different from yours if we're both at 40 reincarnations. Maybe for a character like Ashen Mont, I have a bunch of my HP and attack already, so he's just a big brawly dude. Meanwhile, you've maxed out luck and magic. I'm probably going to win that because you've kind of got his junk stats. Though at the same time, if you max out his luck, maybe if you're running an evasion team, that's even better for you because now we can't hit your Mon. But then there's also certain stats themselves which have this complex interaction with the game, like dexterity or luck, either one really. And it's really hard to say exactly how much that mattered. I mean, did that 1 or 2% extra evasion cause you to dodge? Did that little extra dexterity cause you to get a critical hit? That critical hit factor is just another base way that most of these games add in a certain extra amount of randomness as well. Now, there's a lot of people who specifically zone in on randomness as a thing that they want to avoid in game design, and yet game designers almost always include some element of randomness. Why is that? Well, in my humble opinion, it's because the people complaining are wrong, not the game designers. But the people who think that randomness is a thing that needs to be avoided at all costs miss the point, because randomness, when executed correctly, can create incredibly dynamic matches in a really fun way. being said, with so much of the power creep coming in the reincarnation system and the stats assignment being fully random, I mean, it's maybe the worst intersection of these two things, especially when you combine it with the UI issue that I don't even have any indication of how reincarnated you are, because I also can't predict how that will affect your stats. So this can be a pretty big deal if we're talking about the way that RNG affects your matchups and your ability to win. I think it's kind of interesting. I think it increases our blind spots, and as our blind spots are widened, it also allows more unique plays, more tiny niches to pop up. You can learn a specific way of playing a specific strategy, even using suboptimal units, that is consistently a winner. You can take a bad unit, flip it, and make a big buck in Arena. There's so many things here to praise with complexity, and even with randomness, and even with the way that they interact with each other. While at the same time, it's not great for me, a person who's trying to tell you how to use your team and predict how it will perform for you and allow me to troubleshoot without ever actually meeting you. It's a difficult enough job in this game already, and a lot of these factors are making it harder. But at the same time, I think it's why it's more important to do a data-focused and data-driven analysis of this game rather than just going by vibes. Like, until I see the data for a character, I don't really want to say that much about them. I may like or dislike elements of their kit. I may think the flavor is cool. I may think that they have utility. I may be excited about who I think they can go up against. I may already be theory crafting. But are they good or not? I think at this point always remains to be seen. But in addition to that, if you just want to throw some money to support the channel, help me buy groceries, or help me with my next set of polls, then be sure to do that. And I think if you do it on coffee specifically, you can send me a little note with it and be like, hey, this $10 is for pulling, Fox. $10 is for pulling. And I may even film the pulls for you if you do that. I don't know. There's all sorts of ways that we could do this, but it all begins by you clicking that link in the description. A good way of thinking about this would be to think of randomness like flipping a coin. The coin has two faces, so all things being equal, there's a 50-50 chance it will land on either face. I can't tell you which one is going to land on any particular throw of the coin, although I can guess fairly well. I can also lose half of those guesses pretty reliably. But if you flip a coin 1,000 times, or even more, 1,000,000 times, I can predict that maybe 40 to 60% of those are going to be heads. And I think that number approaches 50% the larger of a data set you end up with. Whereas complexity is more like meteorology and trying to predict the path and interactions that a hurricane is going to have. More specifically, predicting what something is going to do once teams start clashing in War of the Visions is a little bit like trying to predict the direction and force of a specific piece of wind at a specific point in time and space within a hurricane. It's easy to, it's not easy, it requires like really serious predictive software, but it's relatively easy for us now to predict the overall path of a hurricane, although sometimes outside factors accumulate in such a way that we're wrong. But predicting it on this level becomes impossible. When randomness and complexity interact in the way that we're ultimately going to be talking about here, the metaphor becomes a lot more like predicting the flip of a coin in a hurricane. Well, not really, because it's still going to be 50-50, isn't it? But like... that was a terrible metaphor. Moving on. So with status effects, they're inherently random, but they're also affected inherently by complexity. Because A, you could raise your status resistances, and because any character through the Trust Rune system can get a 25% resistance to any status, including Curse. Go, try it out. It's in there now. And this is without mentioning, there's like auras that can cancel out statuses for allies. There are ways of buffing status resistance. There are TMRs that are accessories that anyone can equip that can boost your status resistances to certain statuses. If you strip all of that away, there's still kind of a set percentage chance of it happening. So while you can't predict how it will change the outcome of an individual fight, you can say that in maybe 10 or 15 fights, it will do a certain thing in 6 of them. Actually, probably more, since your counters have, or since you may have multiple chances to cast these statuses. I mean, it's usually a lot higher with counters because you're potentially taking damage within range multiple times in a fight. One of the things that's really changed lately, and again, there have been characters that have been able to do this for a while, although I think in certain cases it was locked to limit bursts quite smartly. But a lot more recently, we've been getting large area effect that does all sorts of certain statuses. Like, we're seeing a lot of poison now. We had a phase where there was a lot of slow. We are kind of on the end of a phase where there was just a ton of sleep. AoE confusion has been a thing a number of times. AoE paralyze is actually kind of old, and again, another reason to bring up Skahal in this video series. That was on his LB. But I want to focus in on a number of statuses specifically that add a lot of complexity, because there's the thing that they do most of the time and the randomness of whether or not they do it, but there's also a lot of side effects to statuses that we don't actually talk about with them. And when those side effects line up in the right scenarios, they can actually be more important than the status effect itself. And pretty much everything that I've mentioned has been a good example of this so far. For instance, my 2 favorite examples of this are poison and slow. So for both of these effects, let's say, and I'm getting this off the slow effect for Veritas of the Earth. This may actually be higher than standard, but 50% slow. That's pretty rough to be hit with, right? But if you have haste in effect, you're getting a 42% speed increase. You go from 142% speed down to 50. That's a decrease of over 60%, going on 70, which is massive. Now, thankfully, like, equipment stats and maybe your trust runes are kind of immune to this. They're outside of this calculation, which is kind of good in this case, as they give you a bit of a safe baseline, but at the same time they don't get boosted by haste, so they're also kind of bad in other scenarios. So you're not going to lose like all of your speed, but if this specific scenario happens to you, you're probably going to go from the fastest or one of the fastest things onto the field to almost definitely the slowest. And we've seen a lot of different characters that have been able to get, especially like offensive DPSs, or maybe more evasive type characters. We've seen a lot more like Time Mage veined characters that can do maybe multiple hastes. So haste is all over the place, but like specifically Ashramont's LB, also looking at Perrine's LB, there's also a lot of LBs that give haste, in addition to a lot of TMRs that give haste, which are becoming like standard to run. So in this environment where everybody is thinking of haste as the default, it becomes really good to be running slow, because not only are you getting the chance to slow, which itself is great, but you're also getting the chance to dispel haste, which in itself is also great. Getting both of these things at the same time means in a specific scenario, which, I mean, until recently in WotV was pretty unlikely to line up, is now more consistently causing a bigger tempo swing in the fight. The same is true for regen and poison. Poison has been, for a long time, a status effect that people didn't really concern themselves with. I think the only characters that really concern themselves with poison resistance traditionally are units that use courage, because that extra damage proccing off can invalidate your courage if it's your last HP. So now there's a whole new class of character that has to worry about poison resistance, and that's technically everybody, because you have units like Shalza, who are supports, that can give both of their partners regen at the same time, in addition to a number of tanks or other types of units like Dialdo, who gets regen as part of his LB. So these units, much like you consistently expect Mont to have haste, you would consistently expect Dialdo to be able to get regen. Therefore, the value in taking away their plus 10% HP per turn for 3 turns, or 30% HP, and turning that positive into a 0, but also adding a negative 30% over 3 turns to that equation, you're seeing a 60% HP swing from a single status. This does happen over time, and maybe they've already got a couple hits of regen, so you're only countering off 1 or 2 of them, which actually makes this even more complex. And the same can kind of be said about haste. If you're catching them on their last turn, sure, they are losing a lot of speed, but they would have lost at least some of that speed on the following turn anyways. And there's also a couple of good statuses that Ready Player will mention that also fit a different pattern, and that's confusion and sleep. The longer you're confused or asleep largely depends on whether or not you get hit by a follow-up attack. Sleep actually has an interesting wrinkle in it that sleeping characters take more damage from the attack that wakes them up. So it is at the very least a damage bonus. If you put a character to sleep, you're getting something good out of that, even in the maximally bad scenario where you wake them up right before their turn. Like, hey, it's time for you to hit me. And confusion can work the same way. It can either negate an enemy's attack while additionally potentially turning it into something that attacks one of their allies. Although, unlike Charm, they can also still attack you. They're roughly attacking whatever's closest in range with a basic attack. They don't necessarily always attack their allies. It is confusion, after all. But also Charm functions under this mechanic as well. So, like, Charm can hugely swing the tempo of a fight by instantly allowing you to outnumber your opponents, but you can also lose that advantage just as easily before it actually reaps its dividend. So there's a lot to be said about all 3 of those mechanics, but another one that isn't mentioned that is probably the randomest status effect that ever randomed is Paralyze. There's a number of characters that can paralyze in AoE. There's also characters like Alaya the Alabaster who can give herself an increased chance to paralyze with one of her AoE skills, I believe. Let's compare Paralyze to Stun, for instance. Stun has a pretty set effect. There's not a lot of complexity or randomness here beyond the initial chance to inflict stun. After that, it impacts a character for a set number of turns, usually only 1. Paralyze kind of works the same way at first, but each turn that a character is paralyzed, and there's 3 of them, they have an 80% chance that they can't do anything. This means that compared to stun, they could be stunned for 3 turns. In fact, it's the most likely outcome that they will be stunned for 3 turns. At the very minimum, I would say the average is positive of 2. So it's better than the best stun in-game, which I think is for 2 turns from the original Tifa on her LB, I want to say. So would that mean that paralysis is always better than stun? Well, no, because the character might, for all 3 turns, not be stunned at all, not be paralyzed at all. That could happen. It's exceedingly rare, but just like with our reflex example, it can happen. And if you're really relying on the paralyze, I mean, I guess that sucks for you.
Now, some status effects have some really important impact on your game that is not really documented anywhere. Now, if you want to see this in the form of a super cool table that explains everything precisely, on warthevisions.info, Meow had done a super good work of compiling all that information into a comprehensive table.
Of course, this also means that with evasion being as much of a problem as it is, there's actually a secret solution to this problem that a lot of us haven't noticed. And at first it was because early in the game the AI wasn't even capable of this. This was actually a feature that was kind of increased for the AI Actually, this is a little bit of a rumor, right? This could have been in the game from the very beginning, except that the difference between accuracy and evasion was never really high enough that it would happen consistently enough that we noticed. But as the power creep grew the potential divide between those two things high enough, we got into a point where it started happening more often. And that is that while offensive characters will basically never use their passive skills that inflict debuffs or stuff on units that they can hit with damage, they will prioritize the damage basically every time. If they have a 0% chance of hitting them specifically, or I think a really low chance of hitting them, I'm not sure where the threshold is here, and the complexity again, but they have a chance. If they have a low enough chance of being able to hit them, they will instead say, okay, well, I should see if I can disable them or something. So there are that number of status effects that I just mentioned, all of which interacting with invasion. If you have this on a particularly inaccurate character that doesn't have a guaranteed hit, then it's going to force their AI to either buff themselves or use that ability on your opponent. And especially if your opponent is magic based, which is really unfortunate for, I guess, Elena specifically, then that high faith is going to mean that maybe these statuses land more consistently. So I guess how you counter Elena in this case is have a really inaccurate unit paralyze her, disable her, stop her, etc. Because then she can't dodge anybody, and she has a higher chance of this happening to her because of her 97 faith than her physical counterparts in other physical evasion units.
Talking about, I just decided that Ayaka was a status ailment as well, so we're just gonna put Ayaka up here on the, because you know what? Ayaka, right?
You could also buy my books. If you think my books are cool, hey, thanks for the money. And I hope you enjoy the book. I write both in fantasy. I have a series that's based on tabletop that I designed and had my friends play through, and then recorded their experiences in the story, added some flavor, and turned it into a series of books. There's also a grittier kind of like near future cyberpunk that's set in the recent past. Kind of gets itself stuck in the grungy COVID era. Very interesting feel because it was a very unique time in history, and I think maybe here in 2024 we've got enough emotional distance from what was a kind of traumatizing experience that maybe we can enjoy fiction set in that unique experience. If that sounds like your kind of thing, check out the book It Even Happens While We Sleep. Links to that and Athena's Chosen are going to be in that link in the description. Athena's Chosen being the first book in the series I said is based on tabletop gameplay. And hey, maybe since you're into Final Fantasy games, that's the kind of thing that trips your trigger. And if it is, check out that book in the description.
Oh, so hold on. Ayaka. There we go. There we go. I actually swore when I was using the beeper there.
I'm Jack. My mission is to chaos.
I want to take a few lessons here for this video, generally from Magic the Gathering. I mentioned this as being the most complex and random game that is largely popular. Definitely the most complex game. Maybe not the most random, the most complex for sure. The first example I want to show you is probably my only example of being able to reduce complexity in a beneficial way within War of the Visions. And if you've been watching the channel for a while, this is going to come as no surprise. I'm talking about the Blade Stream combo. And while I've talked about how this works in a number of videos, I've never really necessarily talked about why. I mean, I have, but really the why is that this reduces complexity in one of the most fundamental ways that you can, other than just outright stopping your opponents from acting entirely. Removing their AP means that maybe not at first, the beginning of the fight may not change tremendously, but the end of the fight will ultimately, for your opponents, if you have chosen them wisely, result in a state where they just do the most predictable possible thing, and that is only use their basic attacks against you, which also means that they have no ranged options, which can mean that on certain turns they do not act at all other than to move closer to you. There is a major downside to this strategy in that it is itself kind of complex, but thankfully this is in a predictable way. The reason I've been pushing this strategy recently is because it works really well against units that have this inbuilt assumption that they will have AP regeneration baked into their kit. Units like Advent Children Sephiroth, Ashen King Mont, and to a lesser degree Elda King of the Lions all fit this profile. And if you can line up one or more of these characters, but preferably two of them, on the same team, you're going to have a decided advantage, at least against those units, and you will be able to push them into a game state that provides them less complexity than they would if you had allowed them to have that AP regeneration. Moving back to our Magic the Gathering example, let's start talking about randomness. There are decks that you would play where, especially in your sideboard, you might want to run protection spells for your creatures or enchantments or whatever you're trying to keep on the field. If you're going up against, say, red, which can just burn them off the field or kill them in some way, I guess black could do this as well, or even blue, which can counter them. Countering happened to be specifically a good metaphor for this because counter effects in War of the Visions are one of two only examples of true randomness within the game, and these can really change the outcomes of fights in certain scenarios. Also, they're more likely to happen because everybody has at least one counter, and some newer units can have 2 or 3 active at a time. I don't think 3, but at least 2. But luckily there are 2 ways of dealing with this, one of which I prefer for its consistency that is a little bit limited in some other ways. There's trade-offs to either of these, but I think one of them is ultimately more predictable, and that's reaction block rate. Reaction block rate can be seen as like a counter penetration, and there are skills that can easily get you to 100% in this, and check your kits and see if you have them. But I'm also going to focus on some ways to add them to your build as well, specifically looking maybe at TMRs or stuff that increase your reaction block rate with a buff. Another thing I want to talk about are Marlboro teams. So when we talk about curveballs, we're usually talking about units that can, through some random chance, usually status effects, win a fight all by themselves or turn a fight around that they shouldn't be able to win otherwise. Luckily, we have a lot of really powerful curveball units that can win a fight even without their curveball statuses, just by virtue of the fact that they're very powerful characters. The champions of this being Sephiroth from Advent Children and Curse, but also Helena the Black Rose with Sleep, both of these being very powerful effects that can turn around the shape of a fight, while also being attached to characters that can still kick your ass even without them. One thing that you might be doing if you want to utilize characters like this is overlapping your team with various characters that have different status abilities to essentially make your team like a Marlboro, one of the most iconic and difficult opponents to face in Final Fantasy titles, because if they survive long enough to use Bad Breath, they inflict such a wide variety of statuses that any amount of preparation, with the exception of ribbon effects, is not going to save you. Also, there is no ribbon in War of the Visions. The closest thing is the last year's April Fool's item, or maybe year before last actually, Balio's cell phone. Now, while these fights are pretty random, I'm ultimately winning relatively consistently within this best of 3 scenario with a team that is, while using basically the same characters, under-reincarnated, has much poorer equipment, has much poorer vision cards, and just really isn't set up well for this. The advantage that they have in this fight is really the fact that they have gone all in on status. And I think that this draws from something in Magic where, you've got 60 cards, but you can only run 4 of the same card. This often leads to deck lists that have 3 or 4 cards sometimes that do exactly the same thing, which means that you have the chance of that effect popping up in your deck now 12 to 16 times, which makes it incredibly likely that you draw it by, say, turn 3 when you've gone 10 cards at least deep into your deck. This works kind of the same way, in that having more characters with more detrimental statuses on your team means that even if your opponent lines up beneficially against them, you're still running enough of them that something's going to work, and that even if the odds aren't in your favor on Sleep, maybe you get a couple of stuns. maybe if the odds aren't in your favor for a couple of stuns, you get to curse their entire team. You have options, you have variety.
Now for the final push, my lord!
It's difficult to build against all of these things. Difficult but not impossible. As I've already demonstrated earlier in this video, changing just one variable within a fight can really change the outcome. So what I'm building here is an anti-Marlboro team. We're going to be running up against basically the same team that was kicking our butt earlier, except that I'm going to be running this as a team with Folka instead. Now, as I noted in my Folka showcase, she definitely does certain things well, and I'm going to be trying to maximize on those in this fight, and it definitely works out to my favor. And honestly, this is the most consistent team I tested all day, at least in this particular matchup. We're running a little bit of an odd TMR on Sephiroth, by the way. He's using Curative Field to give himself and Helena full sleep resistance. Helena herself is running the Balo smartphone that I just mentioned, so she has natively sleep nullification, and Folka through her status, or through her passive Still Waters, also has sleep nullification. So no matter what happens, and no matter how many times we get rose blasted, no one is going to fall asleep. At least unless the match goes on until the regen effect runs off for Sephiroth, and then he can be put to sleep. But consistently we're closing out the match before that happens. I hope that this whole guide has shown you the variety of ways which randomness can be weaponized and even nullified within the game of War of the Visions. The fact that you can do all this just kind of adds to the complexity of it, but in a fun way this time. This is decidedly a very strategically exciting way to utilize complexity and randomness. If you focus on some of the right things, even a large amount of complexity can be reduced to a few key interactions. The problem is it takes a lot of in-depth metagame knowledge sometimes to be able to determine when those key interactions are going to come into play and which interactions are in fact key ones. So with all that being said, thank you so much for watching. Remember, the free-to-play option for YouTube is to like, subscribe, and send me tasty, tasty comments. I may be eating those up and gobbling them out and baby birding them back to you as an audience in a comment response video in the future. But also, while you're down there near the comment section, check out the description. There's a Linktree link that will link you back to my main channel. There's also a podcast version of that channel if you just want to chill and listen in the car. There are ways to send donations to the channel. If you want a one-time donation, send me $10 and a little note that says, hey Fox, you got to use these for pulls. Or, hey Fox, don't use these for pulls. Buy yourself and your family some food, you dirty bastard. Or, if you feel like this video wasn't enough to earn a donation, even though I think complicating, god damn it, even though I'm diving deep into the, by its nature, most complex topic in War of the Visions and trying to make it understandable for you, even as a layman, well, you could also buy my books. If you think my books are cool, hey, thanks for the money, and I hope you enjoy the book. I write both in fantasy. I have a series that's based on tabletop that I designed and had my friends play through, and then recorded their experiences in the story, added some flavor, and turned it into a series of books. There's also a grittier kind of like near future cyberpunk that's set in the recent past. Kind of gets itself stuck in the grungy COVID era. Very interesting feel because it was a very unique time in history, and I think maybe here in 2024 we've got enough emotional distance from what was a kind of traumatizing experience that maybe we can enjoy fiction set in that unique experience. If that sounds like your kind of thing, check out the book It Even Happens While We Sleep. Links to that and Athena's Chosen are going to be in that link in the description. Athena's Chosen being the first book in the series I said is based on tabletop gameplay. And hey, maybe since you're into Final Fantasy games, that's the kind of thing that trips your trigger. And if it is, check out that book in the description. But with all that being said, I'll see you in the next one.